Hi, this video is going to cover conformity, compliance, and obedience. Just introduce you to some of the basic concepts, some of the different examples of types of conformity, and then from there we'll proceed to talk about, in subsequent videos, we'll talk about situational influences on conformity as well as some of the other dynamics. But let's start with conformity and talk about what we mean by that. So we define conformity as adjusting one's opinions or judgments or actions so that they end up more consistent with those of other people or the normative standards of a society or a community, or sometimes a contextually determined situation. There are lots of different ways that conformity shows up in society. Sometimes really, really subtle ways. For example, imitation, right? Imitation is often not really thought of as conformity, but it can be thought of as a kind of subtle conformity. Imitation can be very helpful in social situations specifically. It can help to create social connections. These social connections in turn can facilitate social interaction and social relations that kind of flow from that. We tend to kind of align with and get along very well with people who reflect our behaviors and our attitudes, and vice versa. So imitation in that sense becomes something that is socially beneficial and facilitates a whole host of subsequent kind of social interactions. Some research by Chartrand and Barr back in the late 90s revealed some really interesting aspects of imitation. One, it can occur even among strangers and only after a short period of time, right? So we tend to think of imitation as something that occurs in longer standing relationships, but this research sort of showed that imitation can occur relatively quickly in social interactions, even among people who previous to those interactions didn't really know them. And the conclusion that gets drawn from this, of course, is that people tend to like those who imitate them. I want to talk a little bit about less subtle forms of conformity. I want to talk about specifically what we call informational conformity and normative conformity. So two different types of conformity. Informational conformity is defined as a change in opinions or behaviors that occur when people conform to others who are perceived or believed to have accurate information. So when we are with other people who we think have some degree of expertise or insight that would lead to accurate understandings, when we conform our opinions or our behaviors to reflect the behaviors of those other people, that's what we call informational conformity. It is often the result of what we call social comparison. Comparisons are really useful. They help us to appraise the validity of opinions or behaviors, right? By looking at our opinions or our behaviors and holding them up against or in comparison with those of others. Informational conformity tends to lead to long-term changes in beliefs. This is one of the defining features of informational conformity, is that over time it produces a kind of enduring kind of conformity that reflects an internalization of the views and the expectations of the larger group. This often takes the form of what we call private acceptance. Private acceptance is defined as an actual change in an individual's beliefs or attitudes or behaviors that are the result of these social influences. And that's contrasted with what we call normative conformity. So informational conformity is contrasted with normative conformity, in which people change their opinions or behaviors in order to sort of gain acceptance or avoid rejection. So you conform your opinions or you conform your behavior to the expectations or to the norms of the dominant group, so that you won't sort of be turned out so that you can blend in. So what's happening in this instance is that you get a kind of conformity that is ultimately potentially superficial, right? It's an apparent adherence to or acceptance of the opinions or the behaviors of these others, but no real resulting internal change. So what's getting reflected is a person's adherence to social norms, but not necessarily an acceptance of those social norms. And this is what we call public conformity. Public conformity is just a superficial change in our behavior that isn't accompanied by any actual change in our private opinion. Again, we want to be really, really careful here because we're sort of straying into a space in which there's relatively little empirical evidence for internal changes, right? We don't have a way of going in and independently verifying that a person's attitudinal change, which can be observed, is a reflection of an actual internal change in attitudes. We rely a lot on self-reported data in these kinds of experiments. But I do think, just setting that sort of empirical limitation aside for a moment, I do think it's very, very helpful to recognize that conceptually, conformity can take one of those two different forms. You can have the appearance of conformity, but a lack of commitment to the underlying acceptance of those norms, those opinions, those behaviors, those attitudes, may result in less stable adherence, right? A kind of conformity that can sort of go away as quickly as it arrives. Again, one of the limitations of what we do in social psychology is that a lot of what we're really genuinely interested in understanding is sort of just outside the realm of our ability to empirically verify. So that's informational conformity and normative conformity. I want to talk a little bit about the influences, and this will be something that bleeds over into the next video as well. But I want to talk a little bit about the influences that other people have on our opinions, on our behaviors. We want to talk about majority influence, and we want to talk about minority influence. So conformity occurs whenever group members change their opinions or they change their behaviors in response to the influence of others. And there are two kinds of influence, right? So if we're going to explore conformity, we want to look at the things that are influencing whether people are conforming or not. So majority influence is social pressure that's exerted by the greater part of a group on the individual members or small factions within those groups, right? So the majority is influencing the minority. There is some pretty good empirical support for majority influence. Probably the two that you've heard of, the relatively famous examples, would be the Autokinetic effect and the experiments done by Sherif. These were experiments conducted in a darkened room, and the subjects of the experiment were exposed to lights that would turn on, and they were asked to report sort of the movement of the lights and other aspects of what's going on with these lights. And people would report, the descriptions of the movement of the light within particular ranges. And when the perception of the movement of the light was subjected to comparison with a larger group, with the majority, the range of variation that was reported when these were individual perceptions, that range of variation collapses very, very quickly, and people end up sort of expressing an opinion or a perception that the movement was much more limited and much more consistent with what the majority was saying. So individual opinion varies pretty widely, And once individuals were sort of exposed to the perceptions of the majority of the group, the variability sort of collapses. There's a kind of consensus that's reached in which, that is a reflection, I should say, of people molding their opinion, molding their perceptions to the supposedly the wisdom or the insight or the knowledge that is reflected in the majority. So people are sort of changing their perceptions to sort of reflect their desire to sort of fit in with the majority. The other experiment that is fairly well known and sort of famous is the experiment involving the length of lines in comparison. This is the work that was done by Solomon Asch. So again, most of you have probably heard of this if you've taken any psychology class at any point in your life. And the idea here is that the experiment involved the identification of identical line lengths. That's really hard to say. Identification of identical line lengths. Participants in the experiment were shown 3 lines of varying lengths, and then they were shown a comparison line, and they were required to identify which of the 3 lines was the identical length of the comparison line. And unlike the work done by Sherif, perception is a relatively minor part of this experiment. There's an unambiguously correct answer, right? If it's A, if the line is the identical length of A, then that's pretty obviously the same length. These are not lines that are super close together. So people would come in and they would take this, they would participate in this experiment. And what was unknown, of course, to the participants in the experiment was that all the other people in the room are Confederates. They're in on the experiment. They're part of the experiment design. And their role was to misidentify the matching line. So if the correct answer was A, the group would be instructed to say C. And the actual subject of the experiment, right, the only one in the room that was actually being subjected to the experimental condition, who could see that it was clearly A, would change their response to reflect the response of the majority, right? So that they would give a wrong answer, even an answer that they knew was wrong, in order to fit in, right? They didn't want to be at odds with what everyone else is saying, right? The sort of self-doubt or uncertainty increases dramatically when the majority of people are saying one thing, even though your eyes are telling you something else. So most of the participants, most of the people in the room are selecting an incorrect response, but they're doing that, of course, because they're told to, and the experiment, the experimental subject will change their statements so that their response reflects the response of the majority, and again shows the power of the majority and our desire, or at least the perceived benefits that we have of blending in, not standing out. So that's majority influence. Minority influence is a little bit different. Not obviously, I suppose, if you want to sort of be literal, it's sort of the opposite. Minority influence explores the social pressure that's exerted on the majority of a group by a smaller faction within the group. So the Moscovici did some experiments where they did sort of an inversion of Asch's experiments. Instead of using lines, they were using slides that were of particular colors. And most of the respondents, being subjected to the experimental condition. Remember, this is a minority influence experiment, so most of the people participating in the experiment are actual, people being exposed to the experimental condition. There are Confederates in this research design, but they are a minority. So you might have a group of 4 participants and 2 Confederates. So it looks like there's 6 people in this group. They're all looking at these slides. They're identifying the color on the slide. The 2 Confederates, the minority, if they gave, so they would give opinions, and it was discovered that they could actually give opinions that would end up changing the opinion of the majority. Now, this happens under certain conditions, right? So it isn't just, that they say, A and everyone else is saying B, or these guys are saying green and these other people are identifying the slides as blue. There are 2 conditions under which the minority has the ability to influence the perspective of the majority. One, they have to be consistent and seen as acting on principle, right? So they have to consistently give a wrong answer, and the perception has to be that they're giving the wrong answer because they genuinely believe that it's the right answer, right? So the consistency and acting on principle is really, really important. So those are the conditions under which you could actually get, a minority of 2 people in a group of 6 to change the opinions of the majority of the group, which would be the 4. So again, under certain conditions, minority influence is something that can produce conformity. It's not typical, right? I think typical, and not surprisingly, I suspect, we would assume, and we'd be right, that most of the time conformity reflects a minority conforming to the majority, but it is interesting to note that the opposite can also be true. The other thing that I think is really interesting about minority influence is that when minority influence has the ability of producing conformity, the conformity reflects what we call private acceptance, right? We were just talking about private acceptance versus public acceptance. So minority influence is much more likely to produce an actual real change in opinion, an actual real change in perception. So that was kind of sort of interesting work that came out of the research that was done on conformity. So next time, in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about the contextual or situational determinants of obedience, which are going to be kind of related, a little bit different. But once again, we're going to be looking at the contextual conditions and asking ourselves, how does that produce particular patterns of behavior at the individual level? So sort of core of social psychology, or at least some of it. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. You can reach out via email. You can ask me in class. And if I don't hear from you, then I'll see you next time. Take care.